Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Bob Johnson.
Hi there, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you tell me about your book?
Well, the book is entitled, it's a short story collection coming out from Cornerstone Press in February, and it's entitled The Continental Divide. And it's 14 stories, all taking place in northern Indiana, near the St. Lawrence Divide, which is the lesser known of the continental divides in the U.S. The better known is the one spanning north and south across the Rocky Mountains. But this divide goes east and west. If a drop of water falls on the north side, that water flows eventually to Lake Michigan. And if it falls on the south side, it flows to the Gulf of Mexico. The 14 stories are about the characters living on this divide, mostly in a fictional town called Mount Moriah, Indiana. And what else would you like to know? It's the characters recur. It's not a linked collection in that it's not a novel in stories, but we do find certain characters that show up again. If you read the entire collection, you'll recognize, for example, the marshal Johnny Baker, who's the lawman in Mount Moriah. But there's an old lady named Edith, and there's a man who sells cars, and his granddaughter, who he accidentally elbowed in the cheek during a drunken party and breaks her cheekbone. But he's otherwise a perfectly good guy. The stories are about people in extreme situations. I guess that's the best way I can describe it.
That's very interesting. So, when you were writing, did you start with one story in particular, like at a random point in it, or did you know that it was all going to be kind of this narrative, and not necessarily a narrative, but the recurring characters and everything?
No, I didn't know that. I just found myself. I come from northern Indiana, a small town named Middlebury, and I find myself writing a lot about people and the natural world around there. And as time went on, I realized that these stories were kind of falling into place in kind of a collection form. But I didn't begin writing any of the stories with the notion that I would one day have a collection or build around Mount Moriah. The very first story is about an old lady named Edith who lives in a house smack dab on the center of the Continental Divide. And as the story progresses and as she deals with her former convict son, LT, and her grandson, Wallace, she realizes that she has some decisions to make regarding the fate of her family, regarding whether Wallace, her grandson, who's 25 years old or so, if he could stand to go back to jail, as her son, LT, almost certainly will. And so, as I say in the back of the book, she has something of a Sophie's choice to make about how her family will continue. The Continental Divide as a physical location doesn't recur in the story, though in all stories, my characters face the kind of divides that divide us all, divide of gender and sin and redemption and violence and peace and poverty and richness. And of course, that's true all over the world, but I hope I have given it a kind of a Midwestern, northern Indiana flavor.
Interesting. So, yeah, you were talking about how it's really like a book about all of these different extreme situations, but I'd love to know a bit more about some of the themes that pop up throughout this and how that relates to some of your other writing.
You know, when I hear the word theme, I'm mostly self-taught. I did go to the Iowa Writers Workshop, but before that, anything I'd written, I'd never taken a creative writing class. I wasn't an English major in college and that sort of thing. And so when I hear the word theme, I almost don't know what it means because if you let me read the opening paragraph to one of my stories. It's very short, okay?
I would love to hear.
It's the story is called The Half Hour, and it is one of the later stories in my collection. It goes like this. Maisie Bates was 23 years old and lived with her mother on Crawford Street, while most of her friends had husbands and babies. She was 6 feet tall and had a rash on her elbows that never went away, and her prospects for love had thinned to a few bachelor farmers or the mortician's son, a boy who wandered the sidewalks of Montmoriah and talked to people his father had embalmed the week before. Now, I can't tell you what the theme of the coming story is. Is it themes of loneliness, of singleness, of themes of men and women and marriage and not being married? It's all of those, isn't it? It seems to me that it is. It seems to me that embodied in that paragraph are are yearnings and tensions. I mean, she's 23 and she lives with her mother. Well, what does that tell you? I mean, lots and lots of 23-year-olds still live with their mother. So that doesn't necessarily capture her in its entirety. But most of her friends had husbands and babies. Well, that speaks to a kind of a yearning that she clearly has because she's still single, 23. She's 6 feet tall. Well, the world is full of women that are very tall, and but she had a rash on her elbow that never went away. So, what does that tell you? What stakes are being presented? What tensions? Um, and her prospects for love had thinned to a few bachelor farmers. Well, that tells you something about the physical location of Mount Moriah. It's obviously farmland, and the mortician's son, a boy who wandered the streets of Mount Moriah and talked to people his father had embalmed the week before. So I don't quite know what the themes are, but the themes are kind of like that. People in kind of lost and extreme situations who are trying to sc- scramble and struggle their way out. I had one person one time describe to me um, writing as you're writing about the moral ambiguity of surviving life, the moral ambiguity. Well, what kind of moral choices will Maisie Bates have to make before the story is over? What will become of her? We already know where she is, and we know that she's not very happy about it. We can sense that she's not. I didn't say she was unhappy, but I think we can sense that she was, and that there are certain things that need to happen to her because before there is a sort of a resolution of her circumstances. So when I think about theme, words like theme, I think about things like that. In my view, Flannery O'Connor said, um, stories are about character and action, and theme and meaning, and those abstract words emerge from the characters and their actions. Um, you know what it is to sit in a movie theater and be so engrossed with the movie that you forget you're at the movies. You don't walk out later on saying, the theme of that movie was, you don't do that. You walk out saying, boy, that just hit me between the eyes. When he said X or she said Y, that just hit me between the eyes. That movie changed me. You know the old saying, I laughed, I cried, it became a part of me. Great movies do that. Well, I think great stories and great novels do that too. And they do it not appealing to abstract meanings like theme, but by virtue of their characters' actions, what they do and don't do, by the choices they make, which are all very physical and real world. Anyway, that's my sermon on what my themes are.
That
Character,
was
yeah, does
an
that?
absolutely incredible answer. And I love the breakdown of the text that you did there. How you really I feel like it highlights something. I feel like in poetry you hear this a lot. I also see it a lot in short stories, but it's the intentionality. And that's really what makes up any type of writing is that intentionality. It's like, why are you telling us that this character has this rash? Well,
Yeah.
we hear
Yes.
that, and I mean, if you're just looking at a person and you notice that, it's just a detail about them. It doesn't really matter. But in writing, is this something that's important to the character? Is this something important to how she's immediately perceived? It puts you kind of in the shoes of that character there, which I
Yeah,
think
of
is
course. Yeah.
a different look at theme too, is like from what perspective are we seeing things from?
Yeah.
And
What perspective are we seeing things, and how does she perceive herself? I
Mhm.
mean, as you might guess, the rash comes up again as a subject. Um, but it doesn't have to also. In Flannery O'Connor's one of her most famous stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find, a woman is introduced at the beginning and she wears her hair in a scarf that's tied up like rabbit ears. Well, and we don't know very much more about her except that she's associated physically with a rabbit. Well, at the end, when the murderer in the story asked her if she would please follow him into the woods, she says, yes, please, because she by then is so horrified. But we hadn't heard from her. There had almost no dialogue associated with her between those times. But the fact that her hair was tied up in a bow like rabbit ears, and then she says, yes, please, when he invites her into the woods, we believe it. We believe it just because of that telling stark detail at the beginning.
Definitely. Well, so that being said, how do you approach a story? When you sit down to write, where are you coming at it from?
Well, I was driving out to lunch one day, and there was an old lady mowing the lawn outside a ramshackle old house. And behind that house, there was an older house, a really just a falling in on itself house, and the windows, there was no glass in the windows and that kind of thing. And obviously, I was very interested in her. And then I would always look for her as I drove past that house, which is a place that we often drive. And more and more as time went on, she was using the lawnmower, as one would use a walker because she was so old and thin. And and then one day I drive past and I see a young woman mowing the lawn. And I don't know anything about the young woman, though I suspect that she was the old lady's daughter. And it occurred to me that the old lady was either dead or too infirm to mow the lawn anymore. Well, I just thought and thought and thought about those people, and before you know it, I had a story in mind, and the story is in my collection. It's called Her Precious Things, and it's funny. I was sitting with my wife at lunch later on. I was telling her about the story I had, and she knew the lady I was talking about. And I said, my character, my protagonist, um, is called Joetta Thatcher, and she has a ramshackle old cabin in the back of her house too, wherein she has a box hidden with old coins and different gifts that were given to her when she was a girl. And I said, her precious things. And my wife said, well, that's the title, Her Precious Things. And I said, oh my goodness, that is the title. A chill came over me.
Mhm.
And so how do I go about? How do I start? I don't know. Stuff just comes to me. It's kind of magical, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I don't know
Something.
where they come from.
Mm,
I always had the bug. I always wanted to, right?
You know what? That was actually something that I was just about to ask you about. Because I get authors on this show a lot, and something that has come up for years is like that, the bug, where it's that moment you're kind of you're sitting there and you're just writing, and all of a sudden your characters start doing something, or you put together a connection, and it's not necessarily like you consciously sitting down at the keyboard to do it.
Oh,
Um,
no, absolutely. That's the best time of writing. And sculptors talk about feeling like there's a ghost guiding their fingers.
mhm.
And the best time of writing is when the characters decide what they're going to do, and you are almost not in control at all. And that's a great time. And that's when things happen that surprise you.
So was there a time in this book that something like that happened? The character went a completely different direction than what you were trying to do?
Oh, sure. Although this very second, yeah, yes, there were times, and I can think of them now. I don't want to give too much away because I want people to read the book, obviously.
Mhm.
But uh, the very first story, Edith, I didn't know at the beginning of the story what she was going to do, what her Sophie's choice was going to demand of her. I didn't know what she was going to do, but I sat quietly and I listened. I took long walks with my um, earbuds in, where the music is sort of more so loud I almost can't think. And before I know it, I've got something. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I've got something. And I didn't even realize that I was fussing over the problem, except that when I wake up and there it is. And that's the mystery of the creative process. I had an old man one time who designed farm machinery. He was an old friend of mine back at home. And he would be thinking about plow design. And he'd be fussing over how he was going to make X and Y work. And he'd wake up in the middle of the night and there it would be. Well, that's a mystery. I don't understand how it happens, but it's a great experience when it does. And it's something that every writer strives for, I think. If you find yourself working on it too hard, rather than sort of like letting it go, letting it happen to you, well, then I think you're going to fail.
Hmm. You know, something that I'd love to hear more about. I mean, just hearing how eloquently you're speaking about all of this, and I really want to know more about your personal writing journey, how you got started, and when this started for you.
Well, I when I said I always had the bug, I meant that in my life, even as a boy, I had an inclination that way. I was always called upon, in class to write the funny thing, to, do this or that if we needed it for a comedy show or a school play or something. But then as I got older and I was the head resident in a dormitory where I myself had gone to school. And so my job was to kind of discipline and keep in line the guys living on the floors above me. And I didn't want to do that. It was just a job I had to have because I had to make money. And I bought a little book with blank pages and was scribbling in it one night, and a story kind of emerged that I didn't expect. And it was about I had myself gone to Costa Rica as a student, and they had bullfights there that were kind of ramshackle affairs. And the bull wasn't killed, but men would jump into the ring and dare the bull to charge them, and they'd get away and stuff. And I found myself writing a story about a kid, a North American kid down there as a student who jumped into the ring and got killed naturally because I was kind of in my Hemingway phase, I think. And so everything had to be death and terribleness. And that was the beginning of my writing. And I shared it with people and they said, "Ooh, that's interesting. Ooh." And I wrote more, "Ooh, that's interesting." And that would be the beginning of the writing journey for me. And that was many, many years ago.
That is incredible. So, what started this book for you? At what point, like, what was the moment?
Well, it's a good story. I'm kind of telling on myself. I'm telling on myself as how old I am, but I after I went to Iowa, I was married and I was having a child on the way, and I had to work, so I got into local television in in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which was 45 minutes from Iowa City. And the job was very demanding. I don't know. I've never been able to multitask. I'm kind of ADD, and so it required me to sort of put the writing pen aside. And then I moved back to Indiana, where I taught school at that very college that I had been a head resident. I taught writing classes and the like, and it was also very demanding. And then I left that and went back to television in South Bend, Indiana. And before you know it, um, 35, 40 years had passed, during which I barely wrote at all. And every every New Year's Eve, my wife would say to me, we'd often be sitting in a bar over a beer, and she'd say to me, "What are your resolutions this year?" And I'd always say, "Well, I want to start writing again." And it took retirement, retired at 62, and it took retirement that gave me the time and the impetus to begin to write again. And that's where this book came from after retirement. The 14 stories in it were all since I retired.
That is amazing. Well, I'm so excited that we now have this book in the world and that you were able to write all of these excellent stories.
Yeah, I'm kind of excited too.
So, did you have a favorite character that you were inhabiting in this book?
That I was inhabiting?
Like as you were writing, do you have a favorite perspective to write from?
Well, it's interesting. You asked that. I was thinking about that too. Um, about half of the stories in the collection are written from a female perspective. And I would not have expected when I was beginning to write, I would not have expected to write from a woman's perspective. I grew up with nobody but sisters, and my mom was, putting it mildly, I think she had what's called borderline personality disorder, BPD. And my dad was a very gentle, quiet man who sort of wasn't there much of the time. And but when I began to write, I began to write from a boy's perspective, a male man's perspective of a person who lived in that situation, which was, quite traumatizing when you kind of had insanity and madness around you. And for the longest time, I wrote in a kind of an autobiographical way, and my protagonist was often that guy, and my fathers were often um, sort of gentle and self-effacing, wouldn't stand up for themselves, and my mothers were often variations on the mother I'm describing. And my sister, who's one of my fiercest critics, my sister Beth, one time said to me, uh, I'm tired of seeing fathers like that. I'm tired of seeing mothers like that. I'm tired of seeing women like that. Why don't you write about Barcelona? She said. And I knew what she meant. She didn't literally mean Barcelona because I'd never been to Barcelona. I wouldn't be able to write about Barcelona. But what she was telling me was to get out of the confines of your own history, get out of the confines of your own story, write about other things, write about other people. And I began to write stories from a women's perspective because, obviously I've known lots of women, and I have always been kind of in touch with that side of myself. And those stories are some of my most successful. And so Edith, the old lady, the old country woman, in my story, the first story of my collection, which is called The Continental Divide, I would say she's one of my favorite characters. And I've never known an Edith. That Edith just sprang from somewhere inside of me. I've never known anybody like that. Well, I've known lots of old women, and Middlebury was a country town. And so I've known women like that, and I've known them and their values. And I had a paper route, and there's an old lady who who's I met at her house and folded my papers. But I've known lots of characters like that, but nobody specifically like Edith, who had to make the choices that she had to make. So I would say that she was my favorite character, and I would say that oftentimes I find myself writing with a female point of view. I can't quite explain it, but there it is.
Well, I think it's kind of like that advice, how everyone always says, write what you know. But the real best place that you can be is when you're writing from like an emotion that you know, or a vague
Yes.
situation, or a place, or something, but finding a new perspective in that and finding new characters and new choices.
Yes.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have enough interesting things to write about if we were only writing about our lives.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. When I was teaching high school, I taught 1 year of high school, and in that year, I was asked to direct the school musical, which was Oklahoma. And we spent a lot of time. I read a lot about directing, plays and musicals because I had never done it. So I found books in the library. This was many years ago, and we began to talk. The students and I, we began to talk about our characters' backstories. What were their lives like outside of this hour and a half you're watching on stage? What were their lives like when they were children? Well, and before you knew it, my students began to surprise me by acting like those characters would act, not in a way I directed them to, but they began to find those characters themselves by being quiet and listening and tapping in. And I think that's what the writer does too. He listens and he taps in to
Yes.
whatever that place is. And how it is that I'm able to write about women from women's POVs, I don't know, but there it is.
I've often thought of writing as like you're like reaching out to grab something. And I know
Mm-hmm.
not every writer that I've talked to agrees with this for sure, but the way that I've always seen it is like you're sitting there and you start and you're trying to think about writing, but then when you're actually getting to the place of creating something new is when you are tapping in and you're
Yeah.
finding this other thing kind of outside of ourselves.
I had a favorite English teacher one time when he was talking about the essence of the thing. And he would often kind of reach around behind himself. He'd reach his arm around behind his back, as though the essence of it, the thing, was not entirely graspable. But it's mysterious, and you do your best, and you do your best to grasp it. And then maybe the next person that writes about that same thing might see it in an entirely different way. But the essence, that thing that you're reaching for, is oftentimes a mystery, and it's often not fully graspable. But if you do your best, maybe you can make something happen.
Absolutely. Well, it's like the whole idea of finding the truth when you're writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's something that you'll see echoed in 1,000 books on writing, and lots of authors say it too, but it's so true
Yeah.
because you can feel it even when you're reading a book. It's like this feels honest in that way.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Honest. Absolutely. It feels true. And it feels true outside of um, factually true. It feels
Mhm.
true according to a lived life, and how that life, whether or not if it's not true, you kind of know it. You kind of know you're being conned.
Yes. So
Hmm.
in your own writing, like when you're just physically in the space, sitting down to write, how do you set yourself up? Like I mean, like I'd like to know like literally what your writing space looks like, but I'd also like to know how you set yourself up to kind of find that truth and put yourself in the headspace to do that.
Well, it's different now. Than when I was first writing. When I was first writing, I'd get up at 5:30 in the morning because that's when I was a teacher, college teacher. I'd get up at 5:30 in the morning, and I'd go to a local diner for coffee and a donut, and then I'd go to my office. And before my first class at 8 a.m., I would write. And there was a sense there of well, I'm up at this ungodly hour. I better do something. But also, it was good because the day kind of hadn't done its number on me yet. As I said, I'm kind of ADD. And when I got into the thick of the day with teaching and students and office hours and that sort of thing, I couldn't do anything else. But if I'd get up at 5:30 in the morning and go to my office around maybe 6:15 and write for an hour and a half, um, I was away. I was insulated from everything, including the beginning, the day as it was going to turn out to be. So that was my setup then. Now that I'm retired, I get up and have a cup of coffee and sit in my office, and I more or less write all morning from maybe around, till 9 till noon. And sometimes it goes great and sometimes not so great. And then when it doesn't go so great, I'll get all morose and pouty. You can ask my wife.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, we're almost out of time here, but this has really
Sure.
just been such an excellent interview, and I'm so happy that I got to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. It's been a lot of fun. You invited me to talk about my favorite subject.
Oh, yes. Well, it's mine too, so this is perfect.
There we go.
I just have one more question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I have a lot of stories in the hopper that are not in the collection, and I have thoughts toward a new collection. I don't know when that will happen. Um, they are not Mount Moriah stories, but they still are Indiana stories. So I suspect they'd be kind of the same milieu and the same sorts of uh, issues related to this Midwestern life.
Mhm. Oh, well, that sounds excellent. I cannot wait to read it when it comes out.
Okay,
Read between the lines. My name is Molly Southgate.
and I'm Bob Johnson.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.